I meant to film this much earlier, and I didn't know that my camera was literally dead. I don't know how that happened. I think it must have accidentally turned on in my bag, which happens if, like, just a little switch is flicked and suddenly it's on, because I wanted to get the beautiful sunset out of my window, which was gorgeous. But I mean the night light, like the night skyline, you can kind of see the sunset over yonder, west, out. I sound fucking ridiculous. But yeah, this is from my hotel here in Chelsea, and in this video, I briefly wanted to talk about what retrograde planets mean in the birth chart. I'm gonna do a little fit check. I was supposed to go to an event with my friend. I was running late because of pictures in the sunset, which did not turn out well on my fucking iPhone camera since this was dead. But then the line was too long, so he's like, don't come, so I don't know if I'm gonna go out. This was the fit. Basically, it's the corset that I wear with this bodysuit a lot, and then just this white, I just stretched this out. This is already too big for me. That's why I wear it with the corset, because it's bigger. I was gonna wear this with like my Gucci. I look so short. This is when you can tell my actual height, is when like I do this. Like normally from below I look really tall. This is why my kibby body type is confusing. I was gonna wear it with these Gucci shoes, but I'm not going to, so that's that. I don't think I'm gonna head out. Basically, we're gonna talk about retrograde planets in the birth chart, and of course I will put that timestamp 115 down below when I actually start talking and stop wasting your time. So I get this question a lot, especially during Mercury retrogrades, because people born with Mercury retrograde often find that they experience Mercury retrogrades a lot better than the average person. Now, we have to understand what planets represent, then what retrograde planets represent, then what they represent in the birth chart. So let's run through all of it kind of like a cookbook, which is how I like to explain these things. So a planet represents an actor in the chart, basically. I like to have the analogy of planets being actors, signs being roles, and the houses being the areas of life. So you have actors playing a role in an area of life. Let's say that energy of action, an actor has an action. So all of these planets have particular actions. Mercury's action is communication. Mars's action is aggression. Venus's action is pleasure. When that is retrograde, it appears to be backwards from our perspective on Earth. During Mercury retrogrades, Mercury appears to be going backwards. This is simply because of how our orbit lines up with the other planet in question. It cannot literally go backwards. So do not ever think that Mercury is like saying Mercury is retrograde is the metaphor for saying it's as if it were backwards, but it's not actually backwards because no planet can actually move backwards. I hope we're all on the same page with that. It inverts the planet significations. So instead of communication, it is about going inward and thinking with yourself. Instead of being on time, it's about being late as fuck. Instead of having ease in travel, which let me tell you my Mercury retrograde travel story for a second. I get to the airport as early as I need to be yesterday. I'm flying from Houston IAH to Newark for New York. I get there like an hour to 45 minutes early because I have clear and pre-check, and so I never have a line. I literally never have a line. If I get there before that, it's just fucking wasted time. So I get there at like 11:45 for a 12:40 flight. I know boarding is in 10 minutes. I'm well at the gate, like 5. I go through security, clear, pre-check, 5 minutes, fine. I get to my gate and there's a slight delay. They tell us that they're unloading some extra fuel. I'm like, okay, whatever. It's an hour later and they haven't updated us, and the captain comes on and is like, I underestimated the amount of fuel because we had a plane change. We're like, plane change? He is like, we were going to take this normal 777, this 777. The 777 had a broken lavatory. So we switched to a 777 that was flying to London tonight. That plane had so much fuel that it would have been too heavy, so we had to unload all the fuel. Well, there were like 14,000 extra gallons of fuel apparently, so this was taking, like, he told us it was going to take about 3 hours, so our flight is then 3 hours delayed. We then get on the plane. He's like, they misbalanced the fuel, so now the left wing has more than the right, so we have to unload the fuel and rebalance it. It's 5 hours delayed at this point. We're leaving around 5:40. We're landing in Newark at like 9-ish, around then. So we land, and then we're on the ground for another hour because of no gate availability at Newark, which was very weird because Newark has like 120 plus gates. We get off the plane, no one can find their bags. Like half the plane's bags went to a different baggage claim across the fucking place. I am freaking out because all my belongings are in suitcases while I'm on an apartment tour this week and next week, and you will see me touring apartments. Many of these are going to be like 1 year or shorter availability, which is perfect because I want to buy a place after that. So like I would rather sell my Dubai place, buy a place here, or fund my company, whatever. So that's my Mercury retrograde story. So as you can see, Mercury, which is travel, communication, and getting place to place, not on the same page. So when that is in your birth chart, that energy tends to be more challenging for you than it would otherwise, but you find a different way to make it work. It is not negative, it is not bad, it is simply roundabout. Like if you're taking a route to get somewhere and you have a detour, on the surface, you're like, fuck, I just want to get there. That detour could be beautiful. It could show you a different way of doing things and you could learn something. So it's not quite like having a square from Mars or Saturn where objectively it's like, girl, what's like, I'm sorry. It's more like, okay, you have a different way of operating. Most people with Mercury retrograde, depending on what house Mercury rules in your chart. So for example, if you have Mercury ruling your second and fourth houses, or if you have Mercury's always ruling Gemini and Virgo. So look to the Gemini and Virgo houses in your chart. Mercury represents those areas of life and means that those areas of life you might have had to reconsider, go back and redo, or might have been a late bloomer in them. So Mercury is always going to be around communication and intellect, but first and foremost, it's going to represent the houses of Virgo and Gemini that it rules in your chart. If you don't understand that or know how to do that, don't worry about it. You can skip that and just focus on the communication aspect. But in the house that it's in, it often talks about communication in that area. So if you have Mercury in the 7th and you have Mercury retrograde, maybe you had trouble speaking honestly and directly and very confidently with people early on in relationships and you let them walk all over you. Then you found a way of expressing that might be a little different. Maybe you songwrite, maybe you write poems or something, or maybe you just learn communication. Maybe you had a speech impediment or a lisp. That's a very common representation of Mercury retrograde, is like you had a speaking or learning or like issue like that early on, but now you're okay, you just had to get through that. It's not like a big deal. I would wonder the proportion between people that have dyslexia with Mercury retrograde versus people who don't with Mercury retrograde. Not that there's any judgment or anything there. Like some of those brilliant people have it. Like I said, it's more of a roundabout way of getting to where you need to be. If you have Venus retrograde, this might be around initially an approach to relationships that was not working. You have to relearn and unlearn that for a different style. For Venus retrograde, you want to look to the houses of Libra and Taurus. Those house significations will be retrograde. They're going a little bit backwards. I like to think of it as a detour. You were taking one thing and then Mercury went direct eventually and you had to come back around. Because Mercury eventually in progressed charts will station direct. So often it's helpful to look at the progressed chart, the progressed secondary progressions chart. I don't use secondary progressions often at all, but for retrograde planets, if you notice when that planet stations direct, that can be a turning point for when that planet finally makes sense and is moving forward. So if you have a speech impediment, a learning disability, something like that, and you notice when Mercury goes retrograde a couple years into your life, you might be like, that's the year when finally reading worked out for me, or I started acing school, for example. Mars retrograde, same thing. You're going to look to the houses of Aries and Scorpio for what might be delayed or you had to reverse course in the way that you were getting your point across. Now, Jupiter and Saturn are not quite as relevant for I'd say very, very personal behaviors, but Jupiter retrograde can show that success or that growth takes a little bit longer to stumble upon. For example, I have Jupiter retrograde in my third house of productivity and day-to-day content. I did not grow up being like, oh, I'm really great. I mean, I was a good writer. I always wrote journals, but I would argue that Jupiter retrograde didn't really show up for me until I found TikTok and was making like I literally record 20 to 30 pieces a day and post 5, maybe. I record so many. So it's Jupiter retrograde took a little while for me to find my stride. Even though I was prolific as a young person, I wrote notebook after notebook. I was writing novels that like people are gonna come after me and say I'm lying about this, but I'm fucking not. I don't talk about shit that whatever. I was writing like full ass novels at like 6, 7 of just stories that would go on for weeks. Like I would write them for weeks. They weren't good. I'm not saying they're fucking J.K. Rowling level, but like I would write just extensively, prolifically. And I think that's why I can just continue in short form. But I also have Saturn retrograde. So Saturn retrograde often shows that we had to take on structure and responsibility very early and are learning how to let that go later on. A ton of people will say this, whether they have Saturn retrograde or not. I think a lot of people talk about like, I think if I'm frank and I'm honest, everyone has a tough childhood. Some people's are a little bit more quietly tough, and some people's are more like insanely tough. And if you like, I'd say that people with Saturn retrograde had a toughness early on that was like you had to get it together or you died. Like it was very, very dire usually. And this is not to say you had poor parenting. It could have been a different situation. And by die, I mean I'm I'm being hyperbolic, but like Saturn retrograde was kind of like you literally had to get it together. There was no normal Saturn trajectory. You had to get it together. And if you had Saturn retrograde, you technically experienced your first Saturn return a few months after birth. So I recommend that those of you with Saturn retrograde look to the period when Saturn went direct in your chart, like as a transit, because that was usually a point where there was a turning point in your family or in the structure. For example, I believe if I trace it back, and I talked with my dad about this a couple years ago, the day that Saturn went retrograde, or like that month, that time period, was when my parents separated. So my parents were together like 2-3 years before I was born, and then I was born, and then they divorced 2 years after I was born, but the separation was like a year earlier. Divorces take a while. So I believe during this time was that. So that would have been like a home breaking. So it's usually a turning point when Saturn goes direct. And you had your first Saturn return then, so like Saturn returned first, that was also you had to fucking grow up and everything, but that's an interesting point. I don't think that Saturn retrograde corresponds with absent fathers. I've looked at that extensively because some astrologers say that. I have not found that whatsoever. Now, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are the outer planets, and they're retrograde up to half a year depending on the year and the planet. I do not take those for any, I'm gonna be honest, I don't ever look at your chart and be like, I would never be like, Neptune retrograde, oh, that's a big deal. No. If I'm honest, there's much more important things I can focus on. I don't care to somehow backtest and see if there's a difference in the spiritual awakening of someone with retrograde Neptune versus direct Neptune. I don't think that it's that important. And someone's going to come for me and be like, you have no idea what you're... Okay. It's because it's so often, and these planets are transpersonal, meaning that they represent generational energy, not personal energy, that I just generally doubt that being that important. This is not to say that if it is retrograde alongside like 4 of the retrograde planets, that house does not have a huge retrograde energy, but like generally if you look at your chart, you're not going to be looking at Uranus, Neptune, Pluto retrogrades, you're going to be looking at Uranus, Neptune, Pluto aspects, and if that planet is retrograde and that changes the application of the aspect to be applying versus separating. For example, if Pluto is at 10 degrees of Sag, if Pluto is at 10 degrees of Sagittarius, and Mars is at 7 degrees of Virgo, if Pluto is retrograde, Pluto is applying to that square, which is more intense than Pluto separating from that square. So if Pluto is retrograde, and that means that the proximity, the aspect is approaching rather than separating as if it were direct, that is important, but that does not change the energy of Pluto, and like Pluto's still Pluto, it just depends what fuckery direction it's going in. So I hope that this helps describe how retrograde planets are not bad. I'm not going to say that they're desirable, but a direct planet might not be desirable if it's in its fall. You know what I mean? Like we can't, like it's more about, we took the long way, we had a roundabout nature. It's not bad, it's not at all as if it's in the 12th or the 6th house where it's like overtly like, oh, this isn't a hard area of life. It's like you took a roundabout way there. Like Jupiter's retrograde for me in my chart. Everyone's gonna have some retrogrades. Jupiter's retrograde in my chart. I took a while to find the kind of content that really caught on. I still feel like I'm an older person online, which is so weird as just turned 24, but my audience is also older, which is such heavy Saturn, but having Saturn retrograde ruling my ascendant really was that like I got it together very early and I get to loosen up as I go on, and people with Saturn retrograde natally tend to have a much easier Saturn return because of just the learned experience of ingraining Saturn. Saturn was internalized. If you have a retrograde planet, that planet is usually internalized. And if that's Mercury, that can mean that you're like selectively mute, for example. Just a joke. Don't take that personally. Or if it's Venus retrograde, it can mean that like you keep a lot of your love to yourself and you're not very, you're avoidant attachment maybe. If you're Mars retrograde, maybe you work a lot on like, you're very hard on yourself mentally and that can like beat you up, but like you're a monk then later in life or something. Jupiter retrograde was like, I had such a vast inner world, I had such a big imagination, and I really don't now. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think about sci-fi, it makes me uncomfortable. I think that I'm creative, but like I'm very Saturnian. But I remember as a kid, I used to be just such a prolific writer, and it was really cool, and I hope that I capture child life wonder again in my life. But retrograde planets are not bad, they're not unwanted, they're internalized, they're backwards, and they're slowed down. If you want to look at the date or the general period of your life when things finally pick up steam and you find your way, look at your secondary progressed chart for the date that that planet goes direct, and in a few weeks range, maybe that's true. Also with retrograde planets, the houses that they rule are often delayed or a bit slow to develop, and you might find that they don't come until later in life. Not bad, nothing that you should be worried about. There's no like, oh no, like there's some things in the chart, like having a lot in the 12th house that are like, what was the trouble? Whoa. Mercury retrograde doesn't even mean like it's something bad. It's just like, oh yeah, maybe it was even like I spoke this language for a lot of my life. then I learned this language, and then I moved there, and then my like things like that are not a big deal. So I hope that this was helpful. Let me see if I need to get going. Mercury is retrograde as we speak. I'm being told that someone's friend from BINANCE might have an event for us instead of this thing that is too long, apparently. So, cool. I hope that this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.